Howdy guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video right here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. And we are back once again for the fourth and probably the last Pizza Tower Lost Bits video. And today we'll be taking a brief look at a bunch of the publicly documented pre-release builds of Pizza Tower, as well as a few that aren't public that were made leading up to the final release. And of course, we'll be going over several of the numerous changes that were made to the game throughout its very lengthy development. Anyways, noise is calling, so pick up the phone and slap the like button below. It's time to find some more Pizza Tower Lost Bits. Now, before we get started, I do have to reiterate once again that we won't be going over all of the pre-release Pizza Tower builds in this video, as there are easily over 100 of them, but I'll be focusing on some of the ones that I think are more important in the story of this game's development, as well as a bigger focus on those that have been made publicly available. So on that note, although it may not be the first build ever created, the first one that's publicly documented dates all the way back to July 15th, 2018, and it's simply known as the early test build. For starters here, this build features a different moveset for Peppino. He lacks any sort of attack move, there's no wall running yet, and Peppino can basically only dash, jump, and super jump. And the first of many similarities to the Wario Land series is that just like in those games, in this build, Peppino could actually jump higher than normal by holding up as he jumps. Wario Land was obviously very influential in the development of this game, so it shouldn't be surprising that various things from Wario games are used in here as placeholders. Other things borrowed from Wario games include Wario sound effects still being used for things like collecting toppings and rolling, the flaming Wario theme from Wario Land 3 plays when picking up a bomb, the Wario World stage clear jingle is used when completing the single stage available here, and more. Then onto the actual stage itself. Being this early in development, it's no shocker that it isn't the most groundbreaking level you'd see, and it's basically a mix of a tutorial stage as well as a rudimentary way of showing off how some transformations like the Knight work. And speaking of the Knight, here it has its early controls where it's much slower compared to the final version, and it also lets you do the rather useless little stubby jab attack. This was also way before the priest or any other methods like that were introduced to remove transformation, so for a while, the only way to get rid of a transformation was to take damage from an enemy or touch some spikes. There are two secret rooms that can be found in this level, both of which are structurally different than in later builds and are more akin to those seen in Wario Land 4, and as you can see, they use a nice real picture of a pizza as a background. Another big change compared to the final here is of course the old heads-up display that has the speedometer, head graphic of Peppino, as well as old point counter. And this old HUD was used for most of the development of this game all the way up until an April 2021 build. Once reaching the end of the level, we can see that there's a severe lack of Pillar John. And yeah, the original way a level was going to end was to reach the treasure room where the treasure would be protected by some glass, and after breaking it open and grabbing the treasure, the noise would actually waddle on screen and press a big red button, and then pizza time would start. Although there's no pizza face yet and you don't lose toppings, pizza time works basically the same, but once you get back to the start, we can see that lap 2 works a bit different. Instead of there being a pizza portal that would take you back to the end of the level, you would have to walk all the way back yourself to pick up an extra 200 points there, and then you'd have to run all the way back once again. Yeah, definitely wasn't as slick. Then other interesting things about this build include a different jingle when getting a timeout, Peppino's scream in this build is taken from a different sound library, which, fun fact, is the same sound library that was used as a placeholder for Mario in the Super Mario 64 beta. And there's a different background track here that's actually a cover of a song called Funiculi Funicula, but here it, of course, uses the Wario Land 4 sound font, and as such was dubbed Funiculario. So I mentioned how the bomb transformation uses the Wario Land music earlier, and it looks like, much like Wario Land 3 and 4, each transformation was intended to have unique music, as the night transformation also has its own placeholder music too. This time it's Frog's theme from Chrono Trigger, which honestly sounds pretty dang epic. Now, unsurprisingly at this point, there's actually quite a few things left over unused in this demo build too, so let's go over a few of them here. First off, although many of the Wario Land audio placeholders are heard, there are a few that aren't. These include the Wario Land 4 minigame shop theme that was meant to be used in an also unused title screen area, as well as the elevator theme from the Virtual Boy Wario Land game. Next, there's remnants of a scrapped mechanic in which after reaching Mach 3, the player was to enter a boosted state where Peppino could go faster, do a ground pound, which at the time wasn't part of his normal moveset, and also do a super jump, and this Mach 3 ability also had unique running animations that only get used for a single frame in this build normally. Anyways, this scrapped ability, as seen in this developer footage, has been compared to the Shine Spark ability from Metroid games. Then next, what I think are the most interesting unused leftovers are various unused areas. Now, most of these are just really early and basic levels that mostly just use blue blocks, but there are also some unused levels that are a bit more polished, similar to what's normally featured in this build. Anyways, these unused areas include an early boss fight area against Pepperman where it's much smaller, making it a lot more difficult. There's a test area that was used to test various things like enemy behavior and John Pillar. And then the other rooms also seem to have tested various things, including pushing around a box, boxes that you could bounce off of, boxes that you could seemingly ride on, water that would force you a certain way, blocks that would push you back. Here we can also see the old barrel graphics, as well as the later scrapped ability to use it to float on water. There's the hooks that were scrapped, and more. Anyways, I think these rooms are pretty sweet, and it's really cool to see the game in such a rudimentary state of development. Then for the unused levels that are a bit more complete, these would have been accessible on the old title screen, an easy one as well as a harder one that would have been hidden in this wall here. The easy level is basically another tutorial stage of sorts, and the hard one is that same level again, but with more enemies, spikes, and oh yeah, it's kinda darker. Not really much to say about this one. And that's basically it for this build, but it would be a crime to not mention the derivative Peter Griffin version of this build that was built on July 21st of 2018. Yes, you heard that right, there was a joke build that quite literally just slaps in a graphic of, Peppino Griffin. Hey Lois, I'm a funny pizza man. Besides this, the build remains basically the same, except for getting further in the level, which will trigger more meme audio, and this will start playing a remix of the Cool Whip exchange between Stewie and Brian from Family Guy. Yes, this is a real thing that happened. After this came several tester builds that eventually led to a publicly released Halloween demo on October 31st of 2018. And there were many additions seen in this build compared to the last one. There was a proper title screen, a sequence leading up to the pizza tower where if you didn't know about it, the ground would break apart leading to an old tutorial level, and of course the main part of this demo, a new ancient tower level. Here the player would climb several floors of the tower. John Pillar was added into the game now, but not in a way to end the level, but rather if you collect all 5 toppins, you could feed them to him in order to unlock the optional secret treasure room. And oh yeah, Peppino was now given an attack. He could now slap around enemies who could actually be defeated in this build. Additionally, by using some pizza coins which could now be found around the tower, the player could now buy a shotgun that could also help in ripping and tearing through enemies. Getting through this tower would end up culminating in a boss fight at the top against none other than Pepperman. And although the character is the same as the one seen in the final, this fight is much different. The Pepper fella basically only has the one dash move here that you have to dodge, and after doing so, you could slap him around, and as he took damage, he would start to lose color until finally being defeated. And then once defeated, the noise would once again waltz in order to activate pizza time. Now, if you managed to get an S rank in this build, you would have unlocked a secret dance room, and as the name suggests, here you can just see a whole bunch of characters dancing. Now, apparently, fans were able to submit idle and dancing animations for any sort of character they would want, and as you can see, there wasn't really much quality control for them at this time, so yeah, basically anyone that made a submission had their stuff added in. Then, as far as unused stuff goes in this build, there's this strange pizza arcade image that was meant to be used in place of the Made with Game Maker Studio splash screen that normally appears when starting up most of the early demos. Now this appears to be a screenshot from a map made in Gary's mod, but it's currently unclear exactly where this is from. Following this Halloween demo was a demo known simply as Demo 2 that was released over a month later on December 5th, 2018. In addition to the tower level from the previous build, this one also introduced a factory level that would one day be reworked into the Peppibot factory, and here the old versions of the pizza box and cheese slime transformations were featured. Additionally, the Pepperman boss fight was removed, and in both levels, finally, although still different, John Pillar is used at least part of the way to start pizza time. This meant that unlike most builds of Pizza Tower, here the player was required to collect all 5 top-ins, as you would need to feed John Pillar all 5 of them to unlock a door that leads to the end of a level, where you have to shut down the noise's propaganda broadcast, which will activate pizza time. Here, the pizza coins also had a different function, as instead of being used to buy a shotgun, they were now used to unlock a sort of challenge level for each stage. And these basically tested your skill using the transformations found in each level under a time limit, and they are honestly really challenging with the amount of time that you're given. Now, moving on to the end of 2018, there's one of the wackiest builds of Pizza Tower that was made. The Christmas Race build, or the Grinch build as it's colloquially known as, which was released just in time for Christmas on December 21st, 2018. Now this was apparently a joke build that was made for an event at the Pizza Tower Discord server, and yeah, as you can see, there are a lot of crudely made graphics implemented here, and in addition to Santa waving at us in the background, Peppino was given a nice festive color palette too. And the main gimmick of this build revolves around these flickering snow fellas, where if you touch them, the level will completely reset, putting you back at the start. So basically, you're tasked with getting through the entire level in only 3 minutes while doing your absolute best to avoid these at all costs. And not to mention, all attack moves were removed here, so the only way to defeat enemies is to dash through them. There's, of course, more memes found throughout this level, including a dancing Grinch, videos of Santa Claus, more Grinch, and more Grinch. And if you're a mad lad, you might recognize these Grinch memes are all from Grinch's Ultimatum. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this was made for an event at the Pizza Tower Discord server, and apparently the first 3 players to get to the end of the stage and send in a screenshot of this area would win free access to the first Patreon build that was going to be released. And although it may not look like it all dressed up like this stage is actually a very early version of what would eventually become Oregano Desert. And speaking of the first Patreon build, that one is up next, and this build was released on January 12th, 2019. There were originally plans to release a Patreon build every month, but unfortunately this didn't end up happening. Compared to the previous non-Grinch meme build that we covered, this build also had a desert and mansion level that were included. The desert level is rather short in this build and lacks any sort of UFO section that was eventually added, and then there's also the mansion stage, and this is a level that never ended up making to the final game outside of being just a secret hub world area. This build also finally replaced Peppino's slap move with the dash attack, which honestly I think was a great change. That said, when you do dash into an enemy, you still slap them around for a while, which is kind of annoying, but it's a step in the right direction. And another neat addition that's seen in this build is with this pizza that's been added to the heads-up display. This is actually an early health system, and as you might expect, if you run out of pizza slices, Peppino will pinch his last ravioli, if you know what I mean. Yeah, unlike most builds of this game, here if Peppino takes enough damage, he will actually die and you will be sent back to the hub area, which, speaking of which, was starting to take more shape now. Anyways, the only way you could heal with this health system is by collecting pizza slices, but the only problem is they're quite uncommon in this build, so you really can't be too careless with taking hits. The next major build is the March Patreon one that was released on March 7th, 2019, and this was the first build to be released where development was moved from Game Maker 1 to Game Maker 2. This time around, the hub area was ditched in favor of just having a level select menu right on the title screen, and on this menu, 2 additional levels can be seen compared to the previous public builds, Sewer and Freezer. In these levels, we can see several scrapped concepts that I've discussed in my previous videos, like the transformation blocks, unused enemies, and so forth. Probably the biggest highlight of this build, however, is that in the Freezer level, I believe this is the first public build where the Noise is actually a playable character rather than appearing as an antagonist of sorts. He basically has the same moveset as Peppino here, save for being able to hold the jump button to slowly glide down, and interestingly, although he can build up lots of speed, he does get capped at Mach 2, and as such can't break through metal blocks normally. The solution to this lies in a washing machine transformation here, where the Noise will ride it and then can use it to break through the metal blocks, but ultimately this transformation never ended up making it to the final game. This level can be kind of janky with these mechanics, but I think it's still really cool to see how the Noise was implemented in the earlier days of developing Pizza Tower. Then, after this, came the optimization test build on March 22nd, 2019, and as the name implies, the main purpose of this build was to boost the game's performance, and this was mostly done by restructuring the amount of platform objects the game was using. Probably the most notable other difference is that this build finally introduced Lap 2 pizza portals that work as they do in the final version. So no longer did you have to backtrack all the way to the end of the level anymore before running all the way back to the start for Lap 2. Next, being the 1st of April, it shouldn't surprise you that this next build was an April Fool's joke, and this is actually a build featuring a golf level. Yeah, before it was reworked into an entire level, the golf mechanic seems to only have been intended to be a joke. Anyways, this build only contains the single level, and here, much like the golf level seen in the final cut, Peppino is tasked with hitting the greaseball enemy from the start all the way to a hole at the end of the room in order to destroy the nerd block that's blocking the next area. The difficulty of these rooms varies, but unlike future builds, here you can't aim your hits as precisely, and you can only hit sideways and upwards, making this quite a bit more challenging and frustrating compared to the final version. There's also this really cool Doom-inspired graphic at the start of the level, and this is the first build of this video where Peppino can use his gun. This was a mechanic that was added, removed, and tweaked throughout development, but yeah, basically Peppino once had a ranged pistol attack. Then, after completing the level, the game will also reveal to you a few secret keys that you can press to change up the experience. Pressing F1 would enable Fun Mode, which basically just removes all of the nerd blocks, allowing you to freely roam between areas. And then pressing F2 allows you to play the build as the Noise for some extra replayability. There's also one more key that the build doesn't mention, and that's pressing F9. By doing so, you will spawn in fake Peppino, who at first doesn't bother you, and only after you activate Pizza Time, on your way back, he will finally start chasing you around and attack you near the exit. And I believe this is the first public appearance where fake Peppino was revealed in a playable way. Now, moving on to late May of 2019, we have a few desert builds that were made. Here the hub world was starting to look more developed and even featured a pretty cool mechanic where getting close to a level entrance would change the background graphics to reflect that stage. Anyways, as the name of this build suggests, here we basically see an update to the old desert level with different layouts, the Kentucky Kenny enemies and the Firemouth ability were integrated into the level, the cave section was reworked, and the UFO part was finally added too. Additionally, Peppino's moveset was also different in the main version of this build. Wall running was removed, the speedometer now instantly just went from 0 to 5 on the heads-up display graphics, and Peppino no longer slaps enemies around after grabbing them. These pizza TVs were also implemented, giving the player some pizza slices, which, you know, would have been nice to have back when that was part of the health system, and activating Pizza Time is also pretty unique here as well. Instead of anything we've seen so far, in this build instead, you just stumble upon an unassuming pizza box that just so happens to contain a noise bomb inside of it, which just instantly activates Pizza Time. Yeah, it's kinda strange. Another weird thing here is that although there's still background music, this build contains no sound effects, which makes playing it feel kind of off. Apparently, the sound effects were removed at this time in order to fix up some volume consistency issues. And lastly, beyond John Pillar, here is another stage entrance, and apparently this one would take you to the mansion level, but without modding the game to remove John here, it's normally inaccessible to the player. Next up, we got the Blue Blockland build, or Purple Land Week 3+1 build as it's labeled in the game, which was first released on July 3rd, 2019. As you can see, this build took a step back in the visuals department, and most platforms were now large purple blocks, or these purple fellas. We of course also got the placeholder graphics in the hub world that we went over in my previous videos. It's kind of strange that the last build seemed to be a step forward in developing the hub worlds, whereas this one feels like quite a step back. Anyways, here we have early versions of what became Pizzascape, Ancient Cheese, as well as Blood Sauce Dungeon, and although they're definitely playable, they aren't exactly what most would consider easy on the eyes. And as shown on the main title card graphics of these builds, which change between the different versions, it also introduced stuff like the Firebutt transformation and, more importantly, a much more improved wall climbing ability for Peppino, bringing it much closer to his final moveset. Now next is, I think, probably one of the best received pre-release builds of Pizza Tower, and it's none other than the Sage 2019 build released on September 26th, 2019. Now, for those that don't know, SAGE stands for Sonic Amateur Game Expo, which is an annual community event where various Sonic-related projects are shared and shown off. And how is Pizza Tower related to Sonic the Hedgehog, you might be wondering? Well, aside from being a platformer relatively focused on speed at this point in development, it isn't really, and as such, the devs introduced the totally legally distinct mascot, Snick the Porcupine. We'll get back to Snick in a bit, but yeah, this build introduces a new title screen and area for entering the Sage building, which itself contains the hub world for this build. Inside, we get to meet Snick, as well as see the cool computer setups which are the way of entering the levels in this build: Pizzascape, Ancient Cheese, and Blood Sauce Dungeon, but in a much improved visual state compared to the last build that we went over. There were also a few Sage builds leading up to the main one, which for the most part were pretty similar, except for some of the earlier ones also had contained one extra level known as Entrance, and this was an early version of the John Gutter stage, which served as an alternate intro tutorial level. Did I mention that the levels are much more polished now? Because they are, and they feel much better to play through. Here we also get to see the introduction of Pizza Marts as a way to buy the shotgun for Peppino, which is pretty sweet to use here. Anyways, all that stuff is nice and all, but now back to Snick. So, after completing all 3 of the levels in the Sage build, Snick's challenge would be unlocked, and this basically just had you running through each of the 3 levels again with a 10-minute limit while Snick EXE would haunt you and chase you around in each room. And upon completion of this, you would unlock the ability to play the build as Snick himself. And let me tell ya, Snick is definitely worth unlocking. He has a completely unique moveset, and although he lacks any attack moves, he builds up speed really fast without even needing to hold down the dash button, and much like Sonic, can do a peel-out dash by holding the dash button, basically letting you build up maximum speed wherever you want on the spot, which is incredibly useful. Furthermore, Snick is also shorter, so he can fit through small gaps by default, and again, similar to a certain blue hedgehog, Snick collects onion rings, loses all points when taking damage, and dies if there's no more points to be lost. And the level exits are also changed from the door to a signpost as well. I think these little details like this are so awesome. Snick also has unique graphics for the Knight, Firebutt, and Bomb transformations, as I went over in my previous videos. Snick is incredibly fun to play as, so I think it's a real shame that these are the only builds where he was made playable. I don't know how likely it is at this point, but I really hope Snick eventually does get added to the release version of this game. And lastly, this build also introduced several achievements or cowboy tasks for the player to try and obtain, really adding to the replayability of this build. Honestly, compared to pretty much every other build we've seen so far, although it only contains 3 or 4 levels depending on which version you play, this pre-release build is a major step up. It was certainly a tough build to follow, but around a month later, on October 30th, the Noises Hardoween build was released. Here we got to see a unique hub area that was exclusive to this build, where Snick makes his return covered in a sheet here, but unfortunately this is basically all we see of him here outside of some background objects in the level. Anyways, Noise's Hardoween contains a single level this time, Pizza Scare, and as the name implies, here you play as the Noise, and Pizza Scare is a harder version of Pizzascape. And yeah, not only does the Noise use a different color palette, but so does the level itself and all of the enemies found within it. Throughout the stage, we can also see various festive little set-piece graphics, and these were actually made by the community in a competition where whoever made the best props would get them added into the demo. Honestly, I found this build pretty difficult, especially pizza time, so I think the hard and Hardoween is certainly warranted. Another month went by, and now on November 30th, 2019, a co-op build was made, which added co-op, go figure. We've discussed this in my previous videos, but if you didn't know, yeah, there were once plans, and apparently still ongoing plans, to incorporate cooperative play in Pizza Tower, where 2 players could play as Peppino and the Noise to get through a level. Then, on December 30th, 2019, just in time for Christmas, the Peppino's Xmas Break build was released. Similarly to the previous Halloween-themed build, this one features a Christmas reskinned level, this time for Blood Sauce Dungeon, known here as Stronghold. And just like Pizza Scare, this too is a more difficult version of the regular level, and here we also get to see various really cool level set pieces like enemies caroling, as well as a Game Boy Advance copy of Pizza Tower, which I thought was incredibly rad. And these, just like with the Halloween demo, were made by members of the Pizza Tower community as a part of another competition. Probably the highlight of this level though is that it incorporates a fight against the Noise exclusive to this build, where it was revealed that the Noise was Santa Claus all along. Essentially here, the Noise will pop up out of one of the 5 gift boxes on screen, and you have to rush over to hit him before he starts to move again. You're only given 99 seconds to hit the Noise 20 times, so you really have to be on the ball in order to defeat him. And then, after completing the level once, here you would also unlock the Noise as a playable character with, of course, a festive color palette, and you would also get a simple time attack mode as well. Overall, a pretty slick little Christmas build of the game. Now, moving on to the year where absolutely nothing went wrong with the world, in early January we got a few builds that were centered around reworking the Noise's moveset. The biggest change was that he would now use a pogo stick to bounce around and quickly build up speed. He was given a double jump, an ability to cling to a wall and jump off of it, and then probably the best addition is that after building up speed with 2 pogo bounces, he will start flashing, and then after pressing the dash button, he will utilize his jetpack, which basically works like an on-demand rocket transformation. Much like Snick earlier, this new moveset really shakes up the game, I find, so I think it's really too bad that this alternate moveset was eventually axed. Next up is the Cheese Dragon boss build from February 1st, 2020. Right off the bat, you'll notice that we got yet another hub world here, and this is one of the ones that I went over being left over unused in the final game in a previous video. Anyways, in addition to almost all of the other levels being available here, the Dragon Lair stage was also introduced, and this was initially intended to be a sort of boss level for World 1. Basically, after hitting a few buttons to spawn in some Power Ranger-inspired top-in warriors, this was a gauntlet-type stage that would feature various enemies, transformations, and such from the World 1 levels. The time limit for the stage is pretty interesting too. It's essentially broken up into 1-minute chunks, and after each runs out, Pizza Face will come in and steal away 1 top-in warrior, and only after all 5 are gone will you get a time's up and fail, so basically you do have 5 minutes-ish to complete the stage. And of course, we can't forget the reason that this is called the boss build, as these fellas are added as obstacles at a few sections in the level. To defeat them, you simply just have to carry around and throw an object at them and they'll fly away. Although not a crazy addition to the game, I really like the design of these guys, but hey, at least they made their way into the final game in the old castle secret hub area. Then, less than a week later, the first level editor build was made on February 6th, 2020, and yeah, as the name suggests, this introduced a level editor. There's not too much to say about this. It's a rather basic level editing tool that lets you place down various tiles, objects, enemies, and more. And then of course, you can also play through your very well thought out concoction as well. It should also be noted that this level editor was developed by Certif before they eventually became a programmer for Pizza Tower, so really this was basically a mod for the game that was given the official stamp of approval. Next, on February 16th of 2020, the Desert Playtest 1 build was made, and this featured yet another reworked version of Oregano Desert. Changes here include this door being locked up now, actually requiring you to enter this pizza mart to find the key. The UFO section was changed to incorporate using the Firemouth transformation, and now the noise boulder traps were added as part of going through the level instead of just on the way back during pizza time as it was in the prior versions. You actually have to use these boulders sometimes to be pushed through some platforms, so if you dodge them, you'll have to leave the area and try again, which can be quite annoying. Then, about a week later, another level was seen in the Graveyard playtest, and this of course was an early version of the Waste Yard. It's clear that this is a very early version of the stage, and it's very much incomplete, so much so that this build was actually eventually taken down by the developers. This level also introduces the first time in these builds where we see the ghost transformation that was originally obtained by getting blasted by the ranch shooter fella, and I guess since the tombstone graphics weren't implemented yet, they default to using other graphics like toilets, happy faces, and more. This build also re-adds Peppino's shotgun after it was removed for a while, so it looks like the idea of featuring it in the Graveyard level was at least toyed around with. Anyways, much like the purple block levels from earlier, these levels aren't very nice to look at here. Next up, we have the Western builds from late April 2020, where the first two of these were the first ones to feature the Vigilante as a playable character. By the third Western build, however, both the noise as well as the Vigilante were removed, and the noise was even also taken away from the character select menu. And in addition to that, we got two more levels that were added compared to the previous builds that we've covered, an early version of Fun Farm, as well as Space Pinball, a level that itself was scrapped, but had parts of it reworked into Fast Food Saloon and Deep Dish 9. Then as far as the early version of Fun Farm, much like most of these early versions, it's quite different from the final one. At this point, there was seemingly a much bigger emphasis on puzzles and more precise platforming rather than just mostly speed. And we of course can't skip over talking about Mort, whose functionality was also quite different here. He didn't have a double jump here, and instead you could slowly glide down after holding the jump button. And you would need Mort here in order to break through these comically large 3D rotating cubes featuring the render of Mort from his PS1 box art. Hell yeah. Then, skipping over the second level editor build, since it's not currently publicly documented as I make this video, the third one was released on May 13th, 2020. Not much to really say about this one besides that in addition to adding some new objects and enemies and such from the levels developed since the previous iteration, instead of starting the player in the old World 1 hub area, here we're introduced to a new menu with an online aspect where you can make an account and upload your levels as well as browse those that others have made. Unfortunately, the servers for this have been shut down several years ago at this point, so none of that is functional anymore. Moving on, next are the Beach and Forest builds from early July of 2020, and I'll give you two guesses as to what these introduced. If you guessed early versions of Crust Cove and Gnome Forest, you win a free pizza. Highlights here include the beach stage featuring an idea that was scrapped where you would first start the stage in a ship, and then for the forest stage, this was a point in development before Gustavo and Brick were playable, as here you had to deliver Gustavo's pizza to the customers in the level as Peppino instead. Another neat thing about this build is that here it introduced the breakdance move for Peppino, which before being turned into a little neat extra meme for holding down the taunt button, was actually a more proper part of his moveset and could lead to Peppino rolling around similarly to the ball transformation. Late July also had the fourth and final level editor build, and just like the last one, this one too introduced even more objects that could be added. Not much else to say about it, so let's move on. Now moving several months forward, next is a build officially simply just known as the playtest build, but it has been dubbed by some fans as the pre-Jay Leno April build, apparently referencing a time before McPig briefly changed his Discord profile picture to a Jay Leno looking Joker. But anyways, this build was released on February 25th of 2021. Having like half a year of dev time since the previous build we went over, there are several differences here compared to the last one. We got a new title screen as well as several additional levels: Kung Fu, Space, City, Kids Party, as well as War, which here looks like it was originally planned for World 4 instead of 5 as is seen in later builds. As such, at this point, pretty much most of the levels seen in the final game were now included in one way or another. Some levels, like War, are obviously unfinished, and here we can see a scrapped turret enemy which uses a placeholder graphic and it will blast away at Peppino if he's seen. In the space level, we can also see an early version of the rocket transformation, which at this point in development just uses a simple boost conveyor belt thing to activate it instead of a rocket. Furthermore, the golf, sewer, factory, mansion, and freezer levels were all redone and are now quite different compared to how we saw them in earlier builds. Some highlights of these stages include the sewer level making use of the old way the sticky cheese transformation worked, in which it would let you cling to walls and walk along them, and then the freezer level made use of an eventually scrapped thermometer mechanic, which kind of similar to how heating works in the final version of it. Here parts of the level would melt away as you raise the temperature higher and higher, and of course we get to see a very crude early graphic of that on the side here. Gameplay was also tweaked a bit at this point, as Peppino's gun was reintroduced and could hold up to 3 rounds for it at a time, and the heat meter that we've discussed in my previous videos was added, although no heads-up display graphics were implemented outside of just some text indicating if it was going up or down. And here it seems the heat system was implemented to the point where enemies still changed color palettes if the heat level was high enough. Another big addition is that this is the first build covered here where Jerome was added. Originally, he would function a bit differently though compared to the final cut of the game. Instead of him being a secret that you would need to find in a level, he would have just chilled at the start, and you could only get him to follow you after pizza time was activated, and then you'd have to backtrack all the way back to the end of the level where the Jerome door is typically located. So, in a way, this is a resurgence of the old backtracking version of Lap 2 that we saw earlier. And lastly for this build, although it's not implemented in full by default, some enemies drop gas canisters that were meant to have been used as ammo of sorts for Peppino's chainsaw, a scrapped ability in which he would wield a pizza cutter chainsaw to presumably rip through enemies and other obstacles. Anyways, overall, the game at this point was getting much closer to the final version. And now we move on to the April build referenced in the last one, and this was made on April 3rd, 2021. In addition to the levels being updated and stuff like the rocket transformation now actually using the rocket, the heads-up display was also greatly improved. The heat meter was now made visible, the speedometer was removed, the ammo counter was now moved below the heat meter where it was now seen as some bouncing ammunition, and of course the TV display as it's seen in the final was implemented where it would display in-game status effects and such. Next up come the rework builds of the game from September of 2021, where lead developer McPig decided to try and rework many parts of the game. For one, he wanted to rework how wall running was implemented, so instead of just being able to wall run after running and jumping into a wall, you could now only do it by running up a ramp instead. Now this alone completely changes how the game plays, and as such, this build is pretty divisive, with many fans not enjoying it nearly as much. The hub world was also completely revamped here and was massive. Basically, parts of the hub world would open up piece by piece as levels were completed and bosses were defeated. Many of the levels were also different, and many later scrapped things we've discussed in my previous videos could be seen, including fake Peppino chasing you around, being able to possess enemies with the ghost transformation, as well as an early and much different version of the FNAF-inspired Don't Make a Sound level. There's also, of course, the scrapped Mr. Stick boss fight here, as well as the early versions of the other boss fights in the boxing ring where health bars were used, and the fight against Pizza Head that used the concept sketches as placeholders is here too. There is a lot to this build, so just briefly talking about it here certainly doesn't do it justice, but if you're interested in seeing more of it, check out my recent stream where I played through a good chunk of it by checking out the card on the top right of the screen or the link in the description. Then after almost another year passing, the next major build I want to go over was released on June 13th, 2022, and this was known as the Eggplant build. By this point, not only were graphics added to the level select menu indicating how many top-ins and secrets were found, but the levels once again got overhauled and polished up to now much closer resemble how they are seen in the final release. And true to the naming of this build, as ranks were being reworked around this time, the ranking graphic on the heads-up display was now a temporary eggplant, and upon completion of a level, a unique animation was also used where Peppino would flash an eggplant, with text indicating that ranks were still yet to be set. Now moving up to only 3 months before the final release of the game, we have the October build from October 26th, 2022. Being so close to release, the game is now much more similar, but there are still a few of the many differences I noticed immediately when booting it up. Although the main menu is similar, it still lacks many details. The World 1 hub area has a much different layout that makes it feel more streamlined. No hub secrets have been added yet. A tower climbing cutscene is used when moving between worlds, similar to the one seen all the way back in some of the earliest builds. And what I thought was extra cool with these is that there's a unique background used for moving between each floor. And then World 5 is still pretty unfinished in this build, lacking many details, and the area leading up to the top of the tower is also far from being finished here. Another rather funny thing I noticed is that here, each boss fight still uses a different scream sound effect as a placeholder, and it straight up just does not suit them well at all. Another thing you might notice about the boss fights is that here they use an old version of the health meter where instead of a 2x5 system, a 2x4 one was used, and differently colored layers were also implemented. I guess this was maybe changed as this would essentially give away that you would expect more phases to the boss fight as it went on. After about another month of development, on November 27, 2022, a build known simply as Pizza Tower was built. The amount of differences here shrinks even more, but some highlights I noted including bosses use a scrapped fist indicator graphic of when you can damage them instead of just flashing. The hub secret areas were added in, but some entrances are found in slightly different spots. The entrance door to World 4 is in a different spot and is found all the way down by the sewer level, and the crumbling Tower of Pizza level entrance here is right by the World 5 entrance instead of being up in the long hallway near the top of the tower. The next build I want to make note of is known as Steam Build 1, and this is from December 11th, 2022. Here we can see that the intro cutscene is now implemented, but there's also a really strange quirk here that I haven't seen in any other build. So for starters, not only is the scrapped Cheese Dragon boss found in the World 1 secret hub area, but he's found in all of them, and he's also found just floating off in the void sometimes too. Then, in addition to this, if you enter any of the hub secrets and then enter the boss fight of that floor, the Cheese Dragon will also make a fine little appearance in the background of that fight too. I thought this was a neat little bonus Easter egg for players that found the secret rooms, and I kinda like this implementation. I guess though the decision was later made to dial it back on the Cheese Dragon's appearances. And now, the last pre-release build I want to touch on in this video is the almost finished game playtest build that was made on January 6th of 2023. Things are now largely the same as the final game, seeing as how it was released only a few weeks later, but one thing that did stand out to me was this quit game graphic that was added to the title screen. This was removed in the final game, and I can kinda see why. You use that button to skip through the opening cutscene, so maybe it was deemed that some players would have inadvertently pressed the button and quit the game by accident. Oh yeah, and the John and Snotty approved graphics were also added in this build, which is pretty slick. Now there are a few more builds that were made after this one, but they're basically the same as the final release, so I think we'll call it here. I hope you enjoyed this little trip through many of the pre-release builds of Pizza Tower leading up to its release, making for one of the longest videos I've ever made. As you saw, this game had quite the development cycle. Although this will likely be the last standalone video I make on Pizza Tower, despite almost 2 hours worth of video, we're still only scratching the surface of this game's unused content. But personally, I'd like to move on to covering some other stuff again. Also, just want to give a quick shout out to Trash Bandicoot, Venin0791, as well as everyone else that's helped me in making these videos possible. While you're here, check out some of my other Lost Bits videos, and be sure to subscribe to find your way back here in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for watching today, especially if you made it this far, and I will see you in a bit.